Hello and welcome back to Handheld Computing. Today we're going to add some extra functionality to your Palm device in the form of a tail light. So tail light was a clip that would go on the bottom of your Palm 5. It would add the functionality of a light. So when alarms went off, you would have a light that could flash. You could also use it as a torch. Later iterations also came with multicolored LEDs so that the lights would be able to alter colour. So I've never actually seen one of these. I don't think they were ever marketed in the UK, and I have scoured the internet looking for pictures of them or for some descriptions of them. I even tried the Internet Archive and couldn't find much there either. How do I know I didn't just dream this all up? Well, it's actually mentioned as an option in a few applications. So it's part of the tricorder application, it's an option in Big Clock, and of course there is an application called Tail Light. Of course, without doing some 3D printing, which I haven't got a 3D printer, I'm not going to be able to create a clip-on tail light. But how much better would it be if that function was simply built in? I think you'll agree with me when I say much better. So for this project, you're going to need a couple of drill bits in order to create the hole. You're going to need an LED to drive the light. I'm using a 3mm LED. I would recommend an LED holder, although that is optional. You're going to need some wire. I've used this copper wire with a lacquer on it. It's very thin, but we're not dealing with high current, and so it's perfectly good for feeding to an LED. It also means it doesn't take up much space inside the casing. Because I'm using a copper wire, you're going to need a lighter for stripping the lacquer. You'll need some scissors for trimming the copper wire, a pair of pliers, and a soldering iron. In addition, I would recommend some heat shrink tubing in order to make sure that we don't short anything inside. Before embarking on this project, a word of warning. We are actually going to drill a hole in the case of your device. Because we're using power tools and soldering irons, you can cause damage to yourself, your device, and your surroundings. You do so entirely at your own risk. With that said, let's crack on. If, like me, you're doing this on your Palm 5 or 5X, you will want to watch the battery replacement video just here. Most of the Palms have screw fittings, so they're much easier to dismantle and assess the space to fit your LED. So the first thing we need to do when we've got the back off is decide where we're putting the LED. Now the LED is going to stand proud of the case, so we want to make sure that it's going to sit below this line, otherwise it won't sit properly on the cradle, so we need it above the midline. The second and perhaps most important thing is we need an area with some space. So this area is very clustered, but we've got a lot of just low-lying connectors over here. So there's quite a bit of space in this top corner, and that's where I think we put the LED. So we'll have it pointing up out of the case, and the first thing we're going to need to do is drill a hole in this. So we want it at this level, and we want it about this far in. X marks the spot. So now we've marked up where we're going to drill it, let's do it. So I'm going to put a block of wood down. Of course, I do not wish to damage my desk. That would just be idiotic. We're going to start with a small pilot hole. There we go. The pilot hole is so that, one, we can make sure it's in the right place, and two, it means that the drill won't drift when we start doing the big hole. Here we go with the big hole. So if I've managed to get the size right, this should just slip in. And it looks like I might just need the next size up, so let's do that. As always, better to go too small than too big. So with a bit of gentle persuasion, it's actually gone in now. So because my LED holders are too long to fit in the device, I've had to cut this one down, and it means it won't grip quite the same as it would if it was its full length. So because of that, I'm just going to apply a little bit of glue, and I'm just using a multi-purpose glue rather than a super glue. So we'll just apply a small amount, squeeze it through, let it set for a bit, and then we'll clean it up with a bit of isopropyl alcohol. So the next thing we need to do is actually solder some wires to the legs of the LED. So I'm going to use this very thin copper wire, purely and simply because it's a lot easier to bend around inside the case and it won't take up any space if it's crossing over other things. Although it's very thin, it does actually have a lacquer on the outside to insulate it. So we'll cut a couple of lengths. I'm going to trim it longer than I need. That's purely and simply because it's much easier to trim it down than it is to make it longer afterwards. In order to get a good connection, we need to remove the lacquer. The easiest way of doing that is simply to burn it off. There we go. So I'm just going to hoop the wire around the leg and then simply move it up the leg to where I want it, making sure the end piece doesn't cross over and short it out. We're going to do the same on the other terminal. There are two ways to tell which is the positive and the negative on an LED, as they do need wiring the correct way round. The positive always has the longer leg, but of course once we've trimmed these, that's no longer any use. But you will find that the negative side is chamfered just at the top there on the LED itself. Next up, we need to actually solder it onto the LED. Obviously we don't want it coming loose once we've put it all back together. The LEDs themselves are quite heat sensitive, so I recommend using a pair of pliers or something similar in order to create a bit of a heat sink. This prevents any damage to the LED itself. At this point, it's worth making sure you've not burnt out your LED. Perfect. So we'll tidy these up. We're just going to trim the legs. And before we bend the legs into position, we need to add some heat shrink tubing, and that's to insulate it so we don't get any short circuits within the device. If you don't have any heat shrink tubing, you can use electrical tape. Once that's on, we just need to shrink it to fit. So now we've done that part, we need to attach it to the Palm itself. So on the bottom of the Palm 5 is the connector board, and it's actually separate from the rest of the body. A little bit of a wriggle, and you can pop it out. On the back, you'll see it's got springs which make the connection with the actual circuit board. So it's very easy for us to simply feed the wire around onto the correct pins before popping it back together. Once again, before we actually do that, we need to strip the lacquer from the wire that we're using. And we need to double check which wire is which. And if we look carefully at the LED, we can see that there's a flat edge on this side and a round edge on this side. So this is the negative and this is the positive. So in this direction, the positive lead wants to go to the second terminal in. So what I've done, the same as we did with the LED, is just literally wind the cable around the peg itself. So this should create a good enough circuit. We're going to do the same with the negative. That one needs to go in the fifth from the left. So let's quickly do that. Once that's done, be sure to trim any excess. You don't want it creating a short circuit. Make sure the pins are back in place. And then we can reconnect it to the board. In an ideal world, you might solder this together. However, my soldering skills are quite honestly not up to that task. So now everything's in place, we need to test it before we actually close it up, as we don't want to try and reopen it later. So I'm just going to hold the board in place because it does need a little bit of pressure to keep those pins down. I've opened the tail light app. Let's put the LED so we can see it and see if it's working. Yes, it is. So let's send an SOS. Perfect. So now all that's done, let's put it back together. Just be aware, once the LED goes into the clip, it can't be moved. So it's very important that you make sure that everything's working before you do put it back together. So make sure the LED is sat in firmly. And then we're going to bend the legs down. That should keep everything nice and neat and secure the LED. Now make sure all your tailing wires are inside the case. I'm starting to think I should have gone a little bit shorter with those wires. Once they're in, line everything up and then we'll seal it back together. So for this project, I'm using a 3mm white LED. It has a forward voltage of between 2.4 and 3.6 volts and runs at about 20 milliamps, although it will tolerate up to about 30 or 35. The output from the Palms varies a little bit from device to device, but they all run about 8.7 volts and about 8 milliamps. Normally 8.7 volts would be far too much and would simply fry an LED. But because it's only producing a very small current, it actually works quite well. So the LED requires a minimum of 0.048 watts and it runs up to about 0.072 watts at 20 milliamps. As I say, it'll tolerate a little bit more. The output from the Palm, 8.7 volts and about 8 milliamps, is 0.0696. So this is almost optimum for what we need. It won't give us the brightest LED, but is enough to illuminate it for our purposes, and actually there is enough current to be able to drive 2 LEDs. So of course the light puts some draw on the battery, and obviously it is a small battery in here. However, running an LED at 35 or 40 milliamp hours isn't going to make a huge dent unless you're using it for hours. I think overall it's a nice modification to make. This modification will work on your Palm 3, your Palm 5, and even the universal connectors seen on the M500. I am not sure if it works on the handspring, on the Clie models, or on later Palm 5 models. If anyone does bother to give it a go, please pop a comment below. In the meantime, here's a couple of photos to show you which pins you need to connect your LED to. So before you go ahead with this, it's important that you know that because we're connecting 2 wires across an LED, there are a couple of unwanted side effects. The first is when the Palm is switched on and in the cradle, the LED receives a small amount of current and glows very faintly. The second is that when you hot sync, it acts as if it's a drive display, so it shows you the data transfer rate. I'm sure there are other side effects. I've not had time to test all devices and I've not had time to test all add-ons. So if you're still using the GSM back panel, you better check that this isn't going to interfere before you make this modification. One of the issues if you're going to do this on a Palm M500 is there's not that much space to actually fit an LED, so you might want to go for a much smaller surface mount LED or perhaps a slim cob LED. Either way, it definitely works. I imagine with a rework to some of this software, we could use that small output to drive other things. For example, an FM radio should be possible. If you have any ideas or any modifications you've made to your own devices, I would love to hear about them. Pop a comment below. I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you found it useful, and I actually hope you'll give it a go. If you have enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. That would be enlightening. As always, my name's Hugh, this is Handheld Computing. Thanks for watching.